Hi, everyone. You're listening to The Blockchain Socialist. And for today's interview, I have Quinn Dupont. He is one of the earliest academics that have been studying cryptocurrencies. He is the founder of Alumni Labs, and he is the author of a book called Cryptocurrencies and Blockchains. So, hey, Quinn, how you doing?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
So, I think what would be a good place to start, because you were pretty early in sort of discovering this weird world of crypto in the sort of early days. So I think it would be good to know just like what's the story behind starting to study cryptocurrency, especially at the time that when you started doing it. I'm not sure exactly when it was, but it seemed like it was pretty early.
It was fairly early. I've never, not from 2009, 10, 11, or anything like that when it was truly early. So I started, maybe I'll back up. I was doing my PhD at the University of Toronto studying cryptography. Did my PhD in information science there. So I was studying cryptography, and I had started hearing about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and of course, I thought to myself, "Well, crypto is right in the name. Surely this has something to do with cryptography, and especially its social implications." And so that's when I started getting interested in about 2012, and it was very niche at the time. I wondered how I could learn more about it, so I did the kind of ethnographic approach and started investigating crypto, and that meant setting up a miner. Back then, you could use a graphics card, so I used the University of Toronto's free electricity. Got big graphics card, started doing a little mining, not to really make money, just to figure out what it was all about. And from there, then I thought I saw people doing kind of what looked to me like day trading type, in the traditional finance world. And then I thought, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I'll give that a shot. So I went on to, at the time it was Mount Gox was the big exchange. Of
Right.
course, that
How
blew
much?
up. And so I was part of that. And
How many
I'm
bitcoins?
still, yeah, I'm
You still
still
waiting for?
part of the bankruptcy settlement from Mount Gox. So
Wow.
that's an interesting thing on its own. And then I just continued following it as crypto evolved. It was originally I thought, oh, this is just going to be Bitcoin, and then of course, Ethereum comes around, and then I was part of the DAO in 2016, and I really wanted that to work, and of course, it did not. All the way up to Following it up all the way up to today, where I'm still actively and researching and investigating every new and crazy wild thing that comes out. And these days, I've continued back to studying DAOs. So along the way, I published all sorts of research, everything from more technical kinds of work. I work with the IEEE, which is the world's largest engineering organization. I've helped set security standards with the ISO, on and on and on and on. So a very broad interest in the field, and yeah, so that's kind of my personal biography or whatever, and I'm happy to dig into any of those parts.
That's interesting that you basically took part in a lot of these like very big seminal events in
Yeah.
cryptocurrency history. That you were not just a historian of that, but like a participant of that, which I think gives
Hmm.
a different type of depth to it than I think maybe some academics that sort of like just look at it as like a historical thing. You don't really get at least imagine, I don't know how you think about this, but I imagine you get a more um, a deeper understanding of the at least the feelings that were going on at the time.
Absolutely. I think I always remind fellow academics, or especially emerging scholars, to to appreciate the value of getting your hands a little dirty, to figure out what it really means to go and to set up a MetaMask a wallet, and start signing some transactions. As simple as that. That process is revealing. If you've never used these technologies, it's extremely interesting. These days, I've been busy working with Gitcoin to understand quadratic funding. And of course, I understand quadratic funding from an analytical perspective. I can read the white papers, and I'm very familiar with the technology and the science behind it and all that sort of thing. But it's a different thing to actually sort of be to have some skin in the game is actually how I often think about it, which actually introduces me into, we can talk about this later or now, some of the ethical questions that come up as a researcher and developer in the space. Because, I truly believe one of the best ways to learn about these technologies is to have some skin in the game. And in many cases, actually, the only way, depending on what your research question is, the only way to understand these is to have some skin in the game. It's a bit of a pay to play scenario. And you can imagine all sorts of research that uses, especially quantitative methods and things like that. You might need to buy tokens to be able to manipulate them or to study them, and so on and so forth, especially if you're a computer scientist and on these sorts of things. And then that puts you into a conflict of interest. And so this is something that's kind of haunted me from the get-go, in particular, because I really see a tremendous value in engaging with these things. And so that, eventually brought me around to thinking more seriously about the ethics, about research ethics. And I wrote an article on that, and I offer some kind of guiding principles as to ways to mitigate that. But nonetheless, this is an endemic problem. Researchers, in particular university researchers, who have institutional requirements for things like disclosure of bias and financial involvement and all these kinds of things. It's a very poor situation. Most scholars have not just skin in the game, but actually a financial interest in the things that they're studying, which puts them in, I think, in a very precarious position, and also I think raises the specter of really meaningfully start to question some of the research from otherwise really great academics. I think we need to kind of put it into its proper economic context, and maybe that means questioning some of the conclusions that are derived as well. So I think it's a real serious issue, and it's one I came about to naturally, just simply because I thought it was important to get involved.
Yeah, no, I think let's definitely talk about that in a bit. What I wanted to mention is that I really I resonate with the story in that I'm definitely a fan of like the anthropological approach of like participant observation as a way to really understand like new concepts and like, I mean, in culture, and also when it comes to like this new technology. At least for me, it was also I mean, I was too poor to when I first started to like to like seriously invest in anything, and it was just playing around with things, and it was just like starting up an Ethereum node on my computer just to see if I can do it, just like playing around with the early smart contracts with Ethereum, and that I really felt that it really gave me a much different perspective than just people who were coming from the outside and observing and maybe just like reading articles about how to do something versus like actually doing it. It gives a little bit more depth and nuance to what you're trying to understand.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier affect, right?
Mm.
I think this is really important
Yeah.
to really feel what it means to be engaged in this. So when I was doing some day trading with Mt. Gox back in the day, I remember very distinctly. My wife actually hated it because I became a kind of a crazy monster. The price of Bitcoin went from $20 when I first bought it to 300, and I lost my mind, right? I was like, oh my God, that's so much, right? From 20 to $300. That was amazing. So then I spent some of it. And then I went to 1,000, and I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. And I would be, checking my phone every minute, all these kinds of things. Right. And then, I mean, this is sort of very ancient history, what's kind of makes it almost comical today, but the affect of that, I think, was a really important, just to feel what that means. Right. And especially when we start to talk about more heady things like how we want to design a world that's equal and fair and all these kind of progressive types of activities. I think that's something that can't be separated from our analysis, and I think it's really, really important to kind of to recognize that. And so the first way to do that is exactly as you say, is to go about trying your hand at it and see what it feels like. And it's an illuminating experience.
And I'm curious if you could, because you mentioned you did a PhD in cryptography. or about, was this from like a, I don't know, a mathematical point of view you were talking about
Yeah,
cryptography, and then you just sort of
yeah.
transitioned into kind of social sciencey stuff, which I think is really, really interesting. But yeah.
It's a little complicated to say what my PhD was on. You're more than welcome to read it, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. It's sort of it's a very flawed um, item today, but it has its moments. It I don't know how I would describe it. I mean, in some respect, it's kind of like, if you could imagine, it's about the philosophy of cryptography. This I don't want to go
Like
too much into
cypherpunk.
diatribe on. No, not that, not the ideology, but truly the philosophy. Like, what is cryptography? Kind of
Okay.
types of questions. And this is something I could talk about for a long, long while. But it it provides a way to start to think about the social implications, but it doesn't presuppose the sort of my framework, the way of thinking about it, which has everything to do with notation and notational technologies. Some of this is written up in, I have an article in Meta Philosophy that talks about notational technologies, and that gives some sense of, and I apply it to blockchain. And so it's about a kind of understanding how the sort of fundamental pieces of the technology work, and not presupposing, for instance, mathematics. I have lots to say about mathematics that probably we don't have time to talk about, but suffice to say, I do not think that you can reduce cryptography, or for that matter, computation, to mathematics. And therefore, we need to look for other kind of, I don't know, ontological roots or something like that for when we start to describe these things. It's not to say that math, of course, isn't a very important part of it, but it's there's a different approach that allows us to start to talk about things like affect or social structure or various kinds of dynamics that humans, do.
You seem to be getting at something that I think would be really interesting, is basically like, what is the answer to the particular cypherpunk ethos of like, um, at least my impression of cypherpunkism is that it's sort of like this hyper reliance on math, and that math being sort of like this ultimate truth. With, I mean, very, there is, of course, they talk about, social implications about cryptography, but that's just like inherent to being human, and not really like in so much depth. And maybe like what kind of I think would be, it would have been interesting if there was sort of like a different ideology within the philosophy of cryptography that sort of answered for more of those other, like, more important social questions that the cypherpunks sort of, I mean, are, they don't really get at.
So cypherpunk is a very interesting ideology and a very interesting piece of history. And so, to respond to that, first of all, there's a great quote by Julian Assange, our favorite checkered individual there. He says the universe believes in cryptography. And what he's getting at is something right, that it doesn't, this is why cypherpunks get so excited about cryptography, right? Because they say they want to give the power to the weak or whatever. That it doesn't matter if a password is a password, is this, you can try to crack it for as long as you want. I mean, there's the physics of it, as it were, or at least in their imagination. It really comes down to like physics or math or some sort of real truth that gives you tremendous power if you wield it. But the cypherpunk ethos is one where the history goes back to, I've studied very carefully internet history, and what's interesting is that well before cypherpunks were talking about cryptography, cryptography was actually already part of the internet from almost its inception. Almost. If you want to know more about this, I have an article on what we call edge cryptography, that traces the history of the ARPANET and its transition into the internet, and increasing securitization that we've seen along this longer timeline. And so if you go back to the 70s, there was this, in the early ARPANET, there was this technology called a private line interface, it's called PLI. And this PLI was the very first cryptographic technology that was on the ARPANET, which then became the internet. And I studied how this worked, and it's very fascinating history and everything to this. But there's some moves that kind of got made, and that we've often forget about, in part because most of the theorization of the internet that we have now adopted as part of our history. So when we think about what is the internet, we talk about things like cypherpunk ideology and these kinds of things that emerged. Our history, this historiography emerged from roughly from the 2000s, when there was a bunch of important theorization that was going on. People like Manuel Castells and on and on, all these sort of social theorists. They were writing at a time that actually they took to be a normal state for the internet, but I actually think it was an aberrant state. So the history goes something like this. We have the ARPANET, which was a Department of Defense, it was related. So there's the DARPA and DOD in the United States. They were sort of the shepherds of the ARPANET and then into the internet. And there is actually a number of competing networks that were sort of confidential and completely secure networks that later kind of spun off. But then by about 1993, this is when we start to have that conversation around transitioning from ARPANET to the internet. And we see nascent commercialization. But what's really interesting about the commercialization in 1993 is that the security part kind of got forgotten. It never kind of came along with the internet. And so we have this imagination that the internet was made to be open. And so this is the 2000s, late 1990s, 2000s, the big tech bubble, this moment where we see this technology seems to be this open internet that's emancipatory and it's going to liberate people. And then now, of course, we talk about financial inclusion and on and on and on. And that's where all that theorization happened. And so we look at that and we say, oh, it was naturally open or whatever. But then fast forward a little bit to 2013, you've got Edward Snowden. And by then you now realize that this open network is in fact actually vastly closed. But what happened, it wasn't closed from its inception. It was closed by the need for commerce, the need for e-commerce. You can't have e-commerce without having security, right? That's kind of comes with that. And there's all kinds of interesting questions around how security relates to property and these sorts of things, the sort of political economy that we could get into. But it was an aberrant state. And so post 2013, we now realize we're like, oh, look, it's all secure or whatever. And so now we have to sort of rethink how we feel, big picture about what the internet is supposed to be, what the technology allows, and how the kind of the path dependency that we have out of this sort of checkered history. And then Bitcoin kind of, that when it came around, it changed that question again, because e-commerce, at least potentially now, can move out of the hands of, the Google and the Apple and all those guys or whatever, to from the big platforms down into peer-to-peer, right? So that's that kind of evolutionary move we have. And the cypherpunks, they fit uneasily in there, right? Because the Electronic Frontier Foundation is an essential component of that, right? The EFF, if you look at their sort of ideology, is a really problematic, complicated kind of ideology. And you look at, and they were key. Barlow himself was absolutely essential to this commercialization period in 1993. In fact, he had a company on the side that was selling commercial services, as it were, during that period. So he had some skin in the game to make sure that the commercialization worked in the kind of way that he wanted the commercialization to happen. And of course, now we have the conversation with venture capitalists, AZ16 and those guys. They have this sort of playbook around what we call progressive decentralization. Progressive decentralization is meant to be, it was their sort of practical answer to like, how can we do crypto in a way that, they write it up as a sense of like, you need to be legally compliant, you need to be like regulatory compliant or whatever. And that means you need to be you need to decentralize in the right way so you can pass the Howey test and all these kinds of regulatory tests or whatever. And so that's the kind of process they offer, this progressive decentralization idea. But what's really interesting about progressive decentralization is they pitch it is it leaves the venture capitalist in the mix, because they say you need to come as a tight team first and you need to take in VC money. And with that, you then can, over time, grow the product, grow the community, blah, 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 and then progressively decentralize, right? Leaving, of course, the VC money from the get-go. That's only one option. There's lots of other ways of doing that, right? That's just their suggestion as to how to integrate. And I think it's a telling one.
Right, right. Because at least I don't know if you probably read like Digital Cash by Finn Brunton.
Yes. Finn, I know Finn very well.
Which I thought was really good in terms of like elucidating these sort of like weird tensions within cypherpunks of like, we want, this like secure network of the internet, but at the same time we want like to be able to do all these different types of commercial activity over the internet as well. And there are like certain ways in which those two things kind of oppose each other. And of course, sort of like now today on the internet, the commercial maximalists, let's say, sort of went out on that.
Yeah, Finn's work is fantastic, and his book Digital Cash really describes that early history of Bitcoin and the strange ideologies and the strange collective identities that are part of that. One thing I think that we also do need to be very careful, though, when we're describing such things in 2022 is that, especially when we're being critical, I think things like culture, technology, and regulation, if a criticism has anything that relies essentially on technology, culture, and the regulatory environment, I think it needs to be very closely hewed in on from a historical perspective, because, so for instance, people like a good close colleague of mine, David Columbia, famous sort of critic of crypto, who I think is very astute and says many right things. Many of those criticisms don't really much make sense anymore because they're based on maybe some technological inadequacies. Oh, it can't scale, or oh, it has this or that kind of issue, right? But that's the interesting thing about Dakota AZ16, and software is eating the world, and I think that's true. And in fact, those criticisms are just software upgrades. And today we have largely roadmaps, if not actual engineering solutions, for pretty much most of those criticisms, right? So most of the early kind of criticisms that focus on technology, I don't think are really strong, meaningful criticisms to kind of put the progressive hat on, right? And same with culture. So that's the point about as great as, Finn's work never tries to do anything other than just capture a moment, and so it's sort of in perfectly good shape there. But many people, again, maybe like Columbia would, in his book about talking about like sort of the right wing of Bitcoin, those cultures and ideologies may still exist. The cypherpunk ideology may still be there, but it's not the whole picture anymore. And it maybe it was in 2013 or something, but it's not in 2022. And so there's a specificity, I think, that is really important there. And same with regulation, right? The number of times Bitcoin has been banned or this or that or whatever around the world is astounding. A decade of research really kind of drills that message home. So I think those are actually fairly weak kind of criticisms. And so a lot of my work has been an effort to try to stand up stronger criticisms, ones that are a little bit more foundational, that are not so easy to dismiss, that aren't going to change in just a year or something. And this is things like equality and freedom and these big picture questions, the things that the cypherpunks are sort of, in many cases, usually often driving towards, but don't necessarily, or maybe because of their ideology, are a little clouded with respect to some of the roads that they may take to be able to get to the often same goals. I mean,
Right.
I have a lot of negative things to say about cypherpunk ideology, but I do think there's, in some respects, there's some good stuff there as well.
Yeah. I feel like I may not agree with a lot of things that a lot of cypherpunks say, but I'm kind of glad that they exist in the absence of like there being anything. In the absence, like if it's better than like there being nothing, almost, would
Sure,
be like
yeah.
much worse, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we almost certainly would have had a
Completely corporate,
statist version
or
of, or
that.
maybe just a purely corporate version of the internet today. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Um. Yeah. So like, let's get back to the thing about ethics. I think it's really interesting because I think what I don't know if you've come across this. I mean, I guess you're friends with some of these like academic critics. But I wonder if you've ever come across, because of the fact that you did this sort of participant observation type of study of cryptocurrency. Like, I imagine you would get a lot of people who would say like, "Oh, well, you're just trying to like justify your investments or something like that."
Yeah, yeah.
Like that. That's the only reason why you don't want to see like
Well,
the
to be clear, you mentioned, you said, oh, when you started thinking about crypto, you were too broke to be able to do anything about it. Well, me too. I was doing my PhD at University of Toronto, and yeah, I bought Bitcoin at $20, and as I say, I sold it at 100. So I'm still not rich. I have a bankruptcy, proceedings with Mount Gox from however many years ago, which I guess I'll end up with a few $1,000s or something out of that in the end or whatever. Um, but no, and in fact, I think, but the more kind of seriously, this is a big issue around ethics. And actually, on my website, I do keep a more or less up to date disclosure statement. Right, that doesn't, I don't say here are my assets or something like that, right? But I talk about exactly my financial relationship, and still today, actually, even though it's been a few years now after that article, I started to say, okay, I'm just going in, right? Like I'm I'm no longer free of bias, and I'm usually very quick to tell people, like, I used to be one who had no financial interest. Now, in fact, I now do, but I still have very limited, in part because I don't have any money, in part because y- I don't know. Investing in crypto is, I find, one of the least interesting parts of it, if I'm being perfectly honest. Um, like I said, I did that years ago, and it was interesting, I'm not really, that's not the exciting part for me anymore. So yeah, I think it's a real issue, but it's one that I try to be very careful about, and that to this day I still do not have anything significant, even a noteworthy financial investment. But that's not the case. I mean, just to give you a little background on, so I did a relatively large survey of cryptocurrency and blockchain researchers, largely out of that are focused, that were in university settings, but also looking at like think tanks and this kind of stuff. And the problem is really, it is endemic. The majority of researchers have not just investments for research, but personal investments, like they would label them as personal. And the majority are undisclosed. And then there's all kinds of ways in which the industry has continued to attempt to, well, I think the only way we can put it is by reputation, particularly, and this is the role of the university, is something that I'm very concerned about, is the role of the university in all of this. Crypto and universities have an interestingly tight relationship, right? I mean, they're it's sort of, from its inception, has had an academic kind of vibe to it, and but unfortunately, many of the university researchers haven't necessarily done their due diligence with respect to things like disclosure or other risk mitigating measures that they might take. And there's lots they can do to mitigate some of those financial biases that they might have.
Yeah. I imagine that part of it, it seems to me like to be a cryptographer, like to be an expert in cryptography. I feel like a lot of them, you have to go through like some, at least my impression is like some pretty strenuous, academic like study in order to understand cryptography and all the very complicated math around it. So like a lot of these, if you want to study that, you kind of have to go to a fairly high level, and so like a fair chunk of them are academics.
Hmm.
But at the same time, what's interesting about cryptography is that like as soon as you figure something out, I feel like you can commercialize it pretty quickly, and especially in cryptocurrency. I mean, that's maybe software in general, but
Hmm.
I think in cryptocurrency or in cryptography, especially that could be the case.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the only, I think that's true. The only proviso I would offer is that, well, this, let's be really clear when we're talking what kind of people we're talking about here. Cryptographers are mathematicians.
Right.
Like a cryptographer is they're in a math department in university, right? They probably aren't really good at software development. I mean, they're mathematicians. That's what they do. So those people less so, right? I mean, they don't interact a tremendous amount, like true cryptographic primitives and stuff. Like these have been battle tested. That's the whole point of it, right? The ideas, they're meant to be old, and so actually there is a kind of a slowness to uh, the core technology. Of course, layering everything on top of that, making the cryptography usable, doing software development for like to make it something that we interact with daily or whatever, that's a different story. And many of the researchers, especially people who are studying security, measurement studies, all variety of those kinds of topics, those are the folks who are participating. Again, I mean, I actually think it's right. I mean, I think some oftentimes you have to pay to play. Like you can't. If I want people to be able to study security at scale on a blockchain network. I think that's important. And if they need to manipulate the market, as many have done, like,
For we're manipulating the market for research. That's what's
I mean,
happening
no,
with
legitimately.
do you think that's what's happening with Terra right now? It's research.
If you look back in even just from research from like 3, 4, maybe 5 years ago, the kinds of engagements that researchers were doing, and this is in my paper that's published on crypto economic systems, is the journal. Uh, many of the practices would be considered illegal today, that researchers were doing, and some of them, and then the rest would have been certainly we would consider them pretty much unethical. Like there were
Mm,
researchers who, because these were small nascent networks, you could pretty easily, if you had if you had the resources of university, you could easily manipulate the market. You could move it
right.
around, no problem. And they would do this, and they were doing this for research purposes. They kind of wanted to see what they wanted to see with the network's resiliency. They wanted, these kinds of things. And um, but today, now that these are sort of essential core systems and stuff, systems that people rely on, systems that people have big investments in, I mean, that would not be permitted. You couldn't, in the same way you couldn't go to the New York Stock Exchange and start, um, hacking it and start doing DDoS attacks and all the rest and just being like, oh, this is just research. Don't worry about it. Right. But that's what they were doing. I mean,
Right.
from just a few years ago. And so it's an interesting research challenge.
Would you want to share maybe some of this conversation in particular is coming from like reading um, the paper that you published in Crypto Economic Systems, in which you go over some of these like ethical issues, and then you outline some principles.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to maybe like lay out some of these principles if like researchers would like to?
Yeah, sure,
Yeah.
sure, sure. I mean, so just to be clear, I don't think ethics is, I don't have some, I don't take strong, I'm actually a pragmatist when it comes to ethics. My sort of philosophical leaning would be pragmatism. And so things like, really strong accounts of ethics and stuff, I don't think make a lot of sense. So I'm just kind of trying to offer some, like I say, they're guiding principles, and I've got, there's 8 of them, and so just briefly I can go through some of them. Things like, some of them are obvious, like you're supposed to develop a research life cycle. Like, so one of the things that people often forget about is what happens with these tokens when you're done your research. In fact, as I know, I have a number of colleagues who their lab bought, you know, ETH in 2014, 2015 or whatever, right? And so they got a fair chunk of ETH that they just kind of forgot about it because it was so cheap, right? I mean, we would have these conversations back then. I would be like, hey, let's all just throw in 100, like this is what we did the DAO. There was a number of us who were like, hey, let's just like get $100 or whatever and put it in the DAO and see how it spins, kind of thing. But to do research properly, you should be thinking about like, okay, so our research is done now. Now what do we do with these assets? In the same way you might question what you do with all kinds of research assets when their sort of life is over. But here we're now dealing with, and this is kind of, if there's a conclusion in that paper, we're dealing with values of technology. That values of technology, in that paper, I actually draw parallels to other ethically problematic technologies like nanotech, technology is very small, biotech, technology of the living, cryptocurrencies and blockchains, technologies of value. And value is so deeply baked in that you can't separate yourself from it, right? That's that challenge. So we have to start to think about these kinds of things. And others would be disclosure of interest, like conflicts of interest, thinking about methods is really important. There, like I mentioned before, there was a lot of this research that was happening earlier that would often not use review boards. So at a university in North America, a little less so in Europe. I have no idea what it happens in Asia and Africa. Probably not a lot of institutional review, but you're supposed to, whenever you're engaging with what are called human subjects, you're supposed to go to an ethics review board and you're supposed to say to them, this is what I want to do. Do you see any ethical issues? And they're supposed to get back to you, being well informed or whatever, and say, you know, you have to adjust like this and make sure you're taking care of privacy and no harm and all these various kinds of principles. And there's a whole literature about how to do research ethics properly, these kinds of things. So oftentimes people aren't, first of all, using their IRB, their institutional review boards. So they should. That's an obvious kind of one. But then things like your methods that you're deploying. Early on, there was, and there still today, are a number of, for instance, de-anonymizing methods that are being used. So researchers are developing ways of de-anonymizing cryptocurrency transactions, like, you know, figure out who is who on a pseudonymous Bitcoin network, for instance, right? Now, on the one hand, that's just interesting primary research, and that's security research. That's research where arguably the researcher wants to say, oh, I discovered a way of de-anonymizing people on the Bitcoin network. This is important so that the people who develop the Bitcoin network can strengthen that and you know, make that not possible anymore or whatever, right? Arguably that's sort of the end game, and that's why this research is important. But that's way too simple. Many of these methods, so they're very risky and dangerous because, for instance, people might be using, I mean, we all know what people use Bitcoin for, you know, financing terrorism, you know, money laundering, drugs, you know, all the sort of terrible stuff or whatever. But we also know that it gets used other ways. And in sometimes it gets used by people who might be in political situations that are dangerous. And you can imagine if a bad government came along and went to a researcher and asked them, can you turn over your de-anonymizing methods here, your technologies that you're able to de-anonymize people? We need to hunt out some dissidents that we think are using Bitcoin or something like that. That's a real problem. And if you haven't made that, if you've just allowed, you know, maybe you're working in some kind of country that's not so cool and they ask you for take your laptop or whatever, and they got those methods, that's a huge problem. And so one has to be really careful about those kinds of practices because of the sort of knock-on effects. Similarly, things like disclosing software vulnerabilities. Disclosure of software vulnerabilities is a really complicated topic in computer security more generally. But as people like Iman Gunsur say, in crypto, it's like a choose your own adventure. It's like a $1 billion choose your own adventure. And we see many examples of people working like challenging ones. Like in the paper, I talk about this hack that was on the Bitcoin Cash wallet, and it was an MIT researcher who discovered it, and he was stuck in this really interesting spot where he had found an exploit in the Bitcoin Cash wallet that he could have exploited and used to
Enrich
pilfer
himself.
millions or billions or whatever, right? But he's a good guy, so he wanted to do the right thing. But he was really worried that if he just sort of came out and said like, "Oh, hey, I found this thing," he wouldn't be able, if some other bad guy had found it before him, he wouldn't be able to deny that that was him.
Mm-hmm.
So he was stuck. So he wanted to do proper. He wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to disclose the software vulnerability that he found, but he ended up having to do it anonymously, and only after the fact, after everyone, like after he revealed it and everyone looked at it and said, okay, like when they fixed it and all that kind of thing, then he sort of said, oh, that was me, by the way. And that's not a good situation for now. Security vulnerability disclosure is a problem across the board for security researchers, and there's lots of ways that it gets dealt with, bounties and all sorts of things. But when you're dealing with a technology of value, the stakes are much higher, right? Because like another one, Philip Diane has asked on Twitter and has been engaged with like in classroom settings, and he was a PhD student. Now I guess he's not anymore, I suppose. He was asking, is it okay to have your students, like to teach your students how to hack into a smart contract, for instance, in a classroom setting, right? And on the one hand, this is vitally important information. If you want to secure these technologies, you need to be able to you need to teach students how to how to hack and defend these sorts of things. On the other hand, this isn't toys. This is like the bank. It's kind of like saying, hey, we're going on a field trip, put on your ski masks, we're going to rob the bank, right? I mean, I'm not faulting people. I don't think it's like the wrong thing. It's just one of those really, really difficult problems. So anyways, that's a kind of a sample of some of the guidelines.
Yeah, I am now imagining like some cryptography class in some university of students. Come on, guys, let's put on your masks. We're gonna go depeg Terra.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, and you could say that would be a very fine classroom activity in some sense. It would be a very, very one where you learn a lot.
Right. Definitely.
But maybe ethically problematic.
So now I think it'd be really interesting to transition, because we've talked about all of these different ethical issues just inherent to crypto or Web3, whatever you want to call it, that makes it difficult, that makes it seem, I think, for a lot of people from the outside looking in, a lot of like academic researchers, that the technology is simply like it should be put back into Pandora's box and just like forgotten about and thrown away, or there should be some sort of global ban. We need to stop it. It's the most evil thing in the world. Like we can't solve these issues. But you recently published part 1 of, I believe it's like a 3-part series of where you want to sort of explore what a progressive Web3 is.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how did you go about like thinking about dealing with these types of issues in the development or in describing what a more progressive Web3 would look like?
Yeah. So the first thing to pay attention to, I think, is the specificity around. Here I'm talking about Web3. So again, not so imagine Bitcoin from 2013, not ETH from 2015 in that culture or whatever. Part of it, I mean, so there's a kind of a question of like, what is the research subject here, right? But so Web3 seems to be, I mean, it's many things, and we're putting out a collected edition on what we're calling Defining Web3, with sort of 25 top researchers, where we're all taking a stab at what it means to sort of define, Web3. And so from my own essay in the collection, I'm really interested in like a progressive Web3. And so what would it mean to take everything that we've got from up to this point, all the history and all the various overlapping strands, everything from, as we talked about, cypherpunk to the newer stuff in Web3 and like, regenerative economics and various kinds of DeFi types of mechanisms and interesting things like I mentioned, Gitcoin before and quadratic funding and all these kind of crypto economic mechanisms. What can we do with that and is there an opportunity for a progressive Web3? So it's not to warm over that 2000s era theorization around the internet and being an open internet. I think that's a bunch of bullshit. I don't think we ever, as I mentioned, I don't think we ever had an open internet. I don't think that's the natural state of anything. I think we're actually dealing with security technologies that, especially once we have crypto, they are environments that are secure from the get-go, right? But so how do we then think about the political economy of these sorts of things? And in the paper, I talk about some of the extent critiques, and then I offer 3 of my own that I think are stronger and more difficult critiques that have to do with political economy. And so they're not going to be easily fixed with a technology upgrade. And so they're things like financialization, assetization, quantification, commodity fetishism, and the third one is digital inequality. So these big meaty things, the big meaty problems that we still see in Web3, we see with the Bitcoiners, we see with every other kind of blockchain culture that's out there. These are the big challenges that they're facing. So how do we go about moving from where we are today to a progressive Web3? That this is like I'm still working on this part, but some of the ways about thinking about it are, well, first, it's important, I think, to start to redevelop a sociological model that can make sense of the phenomena. And we need to appreciate the research that's happened around governance and good governance. And many researchers talk about Elinor Ostrom's work around polycentric governance and how, and as people who are in Web3 know, if you want a DAO or any of these or DeFi types of projects, governance becomes super, super, super important. And governance is interesting, right? Because that's a switch off of from talking about government to governance. And so there's very much a downloading responsibility that happens there. And there's a regulatory component of that and so on and so forth. So that's all fine and well, except one of the problems with looking at governance from the perspective of Ostrom is interested in material, or the context where Ostrom was writing were, looking at like overfishing and things like, environmental concerns and these kinds of things. But these are material constraints. And what's interesting is that in Web3, blockchain more generally or whatever, we don't have material constraints. We definitely can produce artificial constraints, right? Token economics. We can create scarcity if we need to. But by kind of naturally, it is an economy of surplus. And that starts to change things when you start to think about, this is an economy of surplus. And why is it an economy of surplus? Well, because we have magic internet money, right? People sometimes say to me, they're like, like Bitcoin seems like such a scam or whatever. And it's like, okay, fine. If it's a scam, I mean, like if you're feeling left out, it's magic internet money. Go make your own. Like, or people say it's a Ponzi scheme. They're like, for only the people who were early on, it's good for them and everyone's sense. And it's like, well, maybe, but you also just described like
every
capitalism.
Market.
Like, every market. Like, I didn't buy Tesla 5 years ago, and I kind of wish I did. You know what I mean? Like, or very personally, what if I had hung on to those Bitcoins from a decade back? I would be, much better off today. So that's the economy of surplus that I think emerges out of it. And so the model I'm working on is one that I draw from the autonomous Marxists, and particularly mostly from Hart and Negri, but some others as well. And I'm looking at this thing they call social co-production. And it's a model of sociality that I think fits Web3 very well. And it moves us away from talking about resource management like Ostrom would, especially resource management under scarcity and constraint, and gets us talking about social dynamics, in particular social movements and collective identities. And when we start to talk about social movements and collective identities, I think we enter into a richer theoretical space where we're able to explain some of what we see in Web3 going on. It starts to make a little bit more sense. Um, things uh, like there's a bunch of questions like, to what extent are collective identities constructed in and through protest rather than preceding it? Or how does, is the identity a group of a group that it projects publicly? Is that the same as the one that the members experience, being inside of it, right? Is there a disconnect there? Or do you come about your identity first? Are you a cypherpunk first and then find crypto? Or is it the other way around? And these kinds of this helps these kinds of social dynamics, why people join, how how these projects can grow and change, and those I think are the ones that need to be captured when we start to think about a sociological model. And a progressive Web3 can take those, and there's a few, I do believe that there's an opportunity to not eradicate inequality, but to engage in something that resembles a progressive Web3. And yeah, and so it also starts to get into questions around post work and anti work.
Right.
This is something that gets talked about in Web3, in leisure class, right? The leisure class has been emerging for 100 years. We're now starting to engage in situations of economics and of material abundance, especially for people in Web3, in part because many of them are just sort of rich because they, are really, whatever, Bitcoiners or things like this. But that the political economy is different for them, right? And some of these people are genuinely trying to use maybe their early fortunes to set up an environment that is more equitable, for instance. So yeah, it's there's kind of a lot of threads there, but the key is here to try to understand the political economy of Web3, and come up with a sociological model that can explain the emergence of, for instance, DAOs, and from there look very deeply at what the real criticisms are, and then of course what some of the opportunities for a progressive Web3 might be. Everything from hustle culture to, as I mentioned, surplus, anti-work, post-work. Of course, a history of automation and AI informs that, right? We're sort of, and I think there's also just to be honest, to have an honest sort of reflection on this. Many people in Web3, their work starts to look a lot different. It's an interesting question. If you're big into DAOs, what your day to day is not is really a very new activity. And Hart and Negri talk very important. One of the sort of the central key insights is that I think it's very important to talk about the biopolitical. So the ways that you can be oppressed by a state or a corporation that aren't part of what we would have traditionally labeled in the domain of work. So there's the biopolitical is the whole experience of life, and that includes leisure. So I think gamification is really important here, and it includes everything else in your life that isn't just that interesting domain. And I think from this is kind of stunningly obvious for most people who are part of the precariat or part of a hustle culture. Yeah, you've got 2-3 jobs, and yeah, you are always on. And I mean, look at a YouTube influencer. The burnout rate is so high because they're just always having to produce. And that's an obvious kind of thing, but it doesn't it's not like work anymore. It doesn't you're not out there digging a ditch or working your job from 9 to 5. And so that's the biopolitical. It's the whole life experience that needs to be understood. And Web3 ties very much into that, right? Because the blurring between work and not work and making money and not making money completely, you could be playing a video game, as it were, in Web3, and that's you're earning money. And yeah, that's not new totally, because people were farming gold in World of Warcraft in 2002 or whatever it was. And so, but there is this is a continuation of many of those same kinds of political economic impacts.
Qualitatively, I feel like it's shifted to where it is kind of different, where it's more. It is just more and is like more systemic in certain ways. I'm really glad that you're studying this, that you're using this framework to study crypto from that lens, because I mean, for one, it's something that I'm really interested in, so I want to read it, and it's
Mm-hmm.
one that I don't have time for to write. So I'm so glad you're doing it. Someone else can do it. Um, but I liked, at least in the part one of A Progressive Web3, I liked the list of the issues that you raised, at least, especially the commodity fetishism one, because I wrote like a blog article, like it was like one of the first things that I ever wrote for my blog was about commodity fetishism of Bitcoin.
Mm.
So that gives me like assurance, like, okay, maybe I wasn't that wrong for that one I wrote.
Yeah, no, I think the only thing I think that's interesting about many of these political economic criticisms that I had to really kind of deal with when I was thinking through these problems is to be true to the sort of source material, not the source material, but the source theorization. So commodity fetishism, this is like, we have to talk about Marx, right? Um, and that's all fine and well. And I think we should study Marx, or we should study these other, Hayek and Smith and all these, like, that's great. We should engage in that literature, and that's our guiding light. But we also need to appreciate that when Marx was writing, I mean, it was like horses walking down the road and stuff, right? Like, it's a kind of a far stretch to imagine that. So the labor theory of value out of Marx, for instance, that we've got, you've got surplus value, and it's encased in labor practices and this kind of stuff. I think that starts to break down actually when you get to Web3, right? And so commodity fetishism and it, I think it's a serious and real critique. I think it's one that's not easily defeated. And, just to kind of give my angle on what commodity fetishism looks like, I'd say basically it's this idea that people believe economic abstraction, that's to say value, they think it's found in some object, but and so they come to think that that object has some intrinsic value. And I think that's that criticism is right, but we also need to appreciate that when labor, for instance, has so dramatically changed, we're not talking about an industrial setting anymore. I think that's where we can start to pry that criticism open. And when we start to look at newer post-Marxist thought, for instance, like, as I said, I think autonomous Marxists have a lot to contribute here. I think then we can start to, we can start to question that a little bit, right? It's not so cut and dry.
Sure, I'm not. Yeah, I think I like Marx. I liked reading his work, and but I was never really. I guess you have some people who are, I mean, like orthodox, almost like
Yeah.
conservative Marxists about everything, and that like that is the only framework, and like everything he says is basically truth. I think those are people who are just generally like, I don't know, they're just looking for someone, just like anybody else does, just like someone to give them answers. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
definitely more interested in this, in like more post-Marxist. I mean, we were talking about this before, basically, but I'm more interested in like I kind of hate using the word post-Marxist though at the same time, so then it sounds like too academic, and people are like, "Oh, what the fuck are you talking about? Don't talk, don't
Yeah.
talk to
Yeah.
me." But that is the truth. They are like post-Marxist. It's like through Marx and through like the appropriate criticisms of his work that you need to make, while also still being true to the ethos of what Marx was trying to talk about and bring about.
Mm-hmm.
I think is super under explored framework of analysis for crypto and Web3.
Yeah. And in part, I think that underexplored nature is because of to go back to, your comment about cypherpunks. Ideologically, like the political economy of the cypherpunk is comes from very different origins, right? I mean, people like, I mean, and this is where Columbia is right. I mean, looks at the right wing side of this, right? And the they're informed by Hayek and the sort of this notion of extremely sort of pure, powerful markets and things like this. And that's not to say that markets aren't that. They are very powerful. They are information processing mechanisms and all this kind of stuff. It's just that you it's hard to then put that into dialogue with some of the concerns of Marx and after.
Right. Yeah. It's part of it is using just very different language and trying to. I mean, you see this in these socialist calculation debates, like how on different sides of the debate they just were using very very different language to try to talk about basically the same things. So there is a lot of like this type of thing. But I was going to say that like in your piece, at least part one, I have to say you were like much nicer about the critics than I would be. But I think that maybe because maybe you know them. I don't know them, so I don't feel maybe as much of a feeling towards them. But I do feel quite strongly negative about some of those critics that you mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, part of it's because I know these people, whatever. Part of it also is one of the things I've learned studying crypto for as long as I have is, most crypto research doesn't age well. In part because crypto has changed so dramatically. Like I remember very distinctly the number of times I've been sort of stupefied that like I'm like, oh my God, like this thing's still going. Like this Bitcoin thing is still like it's changing, it's evolving, it's growing. And I have no way of predicting it. You know what I mean? Like I'm following along like everyone else or whatever. But a lot of the literature that gets written, if you go back and you look at it from just a couple of years, it looks really dated. And it looks dated not just because the world has changed, but rather just because probably there were sort of foundational mistakes. Like we thought the world was like X when it turned out to be like Y. And so I'm always very cautious when it comes to things like criticisms because I think each, to go back to Columbia's work, great stuff. It explains its moment, but it's very out of touch at this point. And it seems to me like it's out of touch because it missed some of the sort of foundational critiques it should have made. As I mentioned, critiques of technology, those are solved with a software upgrade. Regulation changes constantly, and we exist in a neoliberal global capitalist world where the regulatory mechanism is precisely the one that the state is going to use. So also that those are not substantial critiques, right? And then culture. Well, culture changes, right? We have I remember when I wrote my book, Cryptocurrencies and Blockchains, with Polity. At the time, this is when I was doing research about 2016 or so, maybe 2015, 2016. I wanted to speak with people that were in crypto that weren't white men. And it was actually really hard. I actually had to find, like, I had to like seek out, like, I wanted to speak to like women, for instance. I found this one woman, and she was very fascinating because she got interested in crypto or Bitcoin at the time, and simply as a social exercise, like basically around the water cooler, she was working, at her job. There were like some guys, and they were always talking about Bitcoin or whatever. She wanted to be part of the conversation, so she went and kind of started, going down that road. And then of course got into it because she thought it was great and all this and whatever. That's not the case anymore, right? The latest Pew data from in the US anyways, 2020, late 2021, they did a very large survey of we might call market penetration of crypto or something like this. And white men are now actually the minority,
Right.
in terms of holding or accessing or using or whatever. There's lots of sort of exactly what using or being part of the crypto. I mean, we have to kind of define that very carefully. But according to they did a nice study of the Pew folks, and in actually I think Black and I think maybe Asian, sort of in terms of like racial demographics, are now the number one in the U.S. And if you look at the sort of household income,
Like proportionally, I guess.
yep, proportionally, yep.
Yeah.
And if you look at household income, who's accessing, who's using crypto, who's buying, who's investing, these kinds of things, household incomes dropped significantly, right? So now we are actually facing. I think we need to sort of be aware of the fact that as the technology democratizes, to put it that way, right, or whatever, more people using it, we need to think about problems that we never would have thought about before, like exploitation. These are poor people now. They're not the rich whales that we don't, not too concerned about or whatever. These are potentially people who have taken out credit card debt to buy some Bitcoin. And we saw this happen in the 2019 bust. There were a number of 2018, 2019 bust, and a number of people who really lost it all, kind of type thing, right? And of course, now that we get increasingly gamified experiences, gambling, and people with addictive personalities and these sorts of things, I think we need to be very concerned that, so it's not, so on the one hand, we can, and maybe we can keep two conversations going at the same time. We can talk about financial inclusion, making sure everybody has access to the financial resources that they need or whatever, right? And I just did a study with some credit unions, actually, with this think tank called Filene, and we were looking at credit unions, very conventional banking types of situations, and their worries around crypto and how they want to service their members and all these kinds of things. And they, that is the reality is that today is not the same crypto that we had from before, and we now need to worry about not just bringing in new people into crypto, because I do think that there are, like I said, I think a progressive Web3 is possible, but we also need to worry about how this technology is democratizing, how people are using it, and things like exploitation and various kinds of, these are powerful, dangerous technologies, right? We have behavioral technologies that are able to manipulate how people think and engage with one another. And so, yeah, there's a balance there. We have to keep these two conversations going.
Mm-hmm. What I will say is that I have definitely noticed, at least since when I first started going to like crypto meetups, this was probably in like 2016, 2017, to now, is like an increase in diversity generally, at least like, racially or gender-wise, I think especially. I guess as a critic, if Columbia is listening to this right now, he's probably saying, see, this is like white men taking advantage of like the poor and marginalized, or, minorities that like are going to get fucked over by the white men who are at the top because they were early.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's what they're going to say. As like, I think some of the difficulties that I have in these types of conversation is that there's almost always a way to sort of justify your position in any way you want. You can always be cynical.
I think that's a real criticism, and especially in the DeFi VC investment space, the programmer type of Bitcoin stuff. I think that's definitely the reality. I think Web3 at least attempts something different. Now, we also saw a progressive Web2 movement and a progressive Web1 movement. You know what I mean? Like, this is not the first time we've been down this road. And I think Web3 is a little different in that regard. There, in my experiences at the very least, there are people who are genuinely attempting something new, something progressive and inclusive. And if you spend any time in the Web3 world, join some DAOs or whatever, you'll see a lot of that, right?
Yeah, I think critics who stay outside would be surprised if they were to actually engage in the type of peer-to-peer mutualistic relationships that are basically necessary for DAOs to function. That is a very different relationship than like the one you have with your boss in your normal job or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
So I've heard a lot of people say this to me, that when they're in a DAO, it's which makes sense from a labor point of view. If you are Marxists, post-Marxists, or whatever, that's what you would expect. That similar to like the difference between working in a cooperative versus working in like a traditional corporation, like these types of relationships are less, or if they're successful, they're meant to be much less alienating than the one you have at your fucking tech startup or whatever.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't know what that's going to grow into, right? Like I started with the DAO, and its conception of what a DAO
It's
was to
very different.
be
It's
is
very different
very
than today.
different.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why, like, I think, like, sort of academically, I've been lately thinking a lot about social movement theory and collective identity, rather than like Ostrom's governance model or various kinds of like statist or legal types of models when we want to think about these things. But as a social movement, you know, you can put DAOs and Web3 in conversation with everything from, 99% Zuccotti Square type of thing to Arab Spring to just the longer, broader history of progressive social movements. And that, for me, gives us some specificity to be able to talk about the opportunities for being progressive that are a part of the bigger crypto blockchain world. But again, I don't know what they're going to kind of grow to. And in many cases, Web3 doesn't, realize its own potential. There's lots of examples where we see people, I mean, it can be, being inside of a DAO can be also it can be alienating, it can be very cliquey, right? Getting, how do you join these groups and all that kind of stuff. There's still all those sorts of things to be. So I think there's a lot of unrealized potential, is maybe one way to put it. And that's part of the reason why I'm so interested in trying to draw a bit of a roadmap as well. And that's what this article is supposed to do, is to be able to help people that are the leaders of these to think about different ways of organizing them. So one of the, like, just a basic kind of thing that Hart and Negri talk about, they talk about this like governance needs to invert strategy and tactics. They say that like long-term, like, strategy should be for the movement, for the masses, for the people, and that tactics should be relegated to the leadership. And that's an interesting, and they do this, of course, to say they want to destroy the sovereign, right? And why you want to destroy the sovereign is so that you can not represent yourself, but rather have a post-representational political situation. And that's one of those things, that's like a practical lesson, I think, that leaders of DAOs could start to think about. Like, and this is how, and this, insofar as that is a true conclusion, that may help this nascent effort grow. And it's also part of, I mean, if we wanted to, we're no longer in the world of political. There's not a political economy where you have to be somehow pure and perfect. We are talking about like cooperatives. We are talking about ways that people can make money. We can, it's not all just sort of kumbaya and wonderful stuff. I
We're all
think
gonna
that
make
there
it.
is, yeah, and I mean, like, hustle culture is part of that, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Optimization and there's tons of negativities that happen there. And there's, like, hustle culture will take its pound of flesh from burnout and different kinds of alienation and these sorts of things as well.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to cover this since you published this article through on Mirror through a group that you've called Alumni Labs. Do you want to describe? From what I understand, it's sort of like a research collective that you're creating of with various different academics to sort of explore this crypto space in like a not within the confines of the academic institution.
Yeah, it's main Alumni Labs is just my effort to, its primary goal is one that's born out of this question around identity. So, as sort of, I'm sure many people know, nobody on the internet knows your dog is the old joke. The identity layer of, to go back to that kind of history of the internet, that commercialization process I was talking about, identity was never part of that. We sort of understand that, and we know that today. And blockchain has a potential identity answer, right? Self-sovereign identities and so on and so forth. And so it's a contribution. Alumni Labs is an effort to make a contribution to that story, to that side of things, this growing need for identity, and specifically an identity that's not controlled by third-party, giant platforms, and Google, and so on and so forth. And the number, and I've thought about this project, this identity question for a long time, and as the education chair at the IEEE, there's like 400,000 members, they're engineers, and they have like all sorts of educational activities, and basically just want their members to be able to get like credit for taking courses and this and that or whatever. And so they approached me and they said, I think blockchain probably has a solution here. Like, tell me about, like, what would it mean to do that, to get a blockchain solution for IEEE credentials for taking courses and these kinds of things. That led me from one thing to another, to eventually realizing that this is a bigger problem, and that I think one of the most important strategic assets that Web3 needs to sort of go after are university credentials, in part because, as I mentioned before, there's this interesting relationship between academia and crypto, but also because the biggest university credential is university diploma, right? And it's a very important trust asset. It's an IRL trust asset, and I think
I've heard it talked to as well as like a type of currency.
Sure. I mean, reputational currency as well. And reputation and trust are interestingly intertwined. And there are all kinds of challenges here. I mean, things like, reputation and trust can also be very problematic and negative, right? Elitism can emerge out of these kinds of things. But putting all that aside, or managing, maybe keeping multiple conversations, going on the same time, would be a better way to put it. The question becomes, how does one get a university diploma on a blockchain? It seems obvious. The technology is there. It's very simple. In fact, there's like tutorials you can do. Like, if you want to learn like basics of Solidity, you can take a 1-hour course and you can make your own university diploma. So the problem is not about the technology, and this is one of those classic crypto types of problems. People think, oh, it must just be we just need some like perfect piece of technology. It's the social stuff around it, in particular the broken business model. So without going too much depth here, there was this MIT developed a university credential platform that was then, I don't know if it was bought or given to or whatever, some company, I think they're called Highland, or a credential company. And now we have this quote unquote open standard that's kind of, company is languishing under the, domain of this company. And their business model strikes me as being something along the lines of, well, we'll go approach universities with our sales team and we'll try to sell them, per seat, whatever, $10 or $100, however much it might be, to issue a university diploma on a blockchain or something like this, right? But that's like the business model is not one that ever will work, for like lots of obvious reasons. Universities have high integration costs. They're just not too interested in doing this, despite massive fraud. That's the other part of this, of course, is universities have massive fraud problems. They know that university diplomas are continuously used in fraudulent settings and this kind of thing. So how do they do it? So for me, this is where I'm like, okay, if the question becomes, how do we get a university diploma on a blockchain, the answer seems to me to be like with as much crypto as possible, but like in the right way or whatever. And so my effort there is, I'm going to be working on submitting the next round, actually, of funding through Gitcoin, because Gitcoin is a public goods funding mechanism. And I think that's right. I think a university diploma is one that ought to be developed as a public good, so that ideally, once we have like whatever, say all or most of the university diplomas on a blockchain, they're public accessible, and I could, if I wanted to interact with you, I could actually verify you are who you are. So it's a proof of humanity, proof of personhood, but much deeper, because it also has all kinds of relationships. It says a lot about who you are, in fact. And this is where reputation starts to get really important, right? Like, you know, there's a sociological fact about homophily, right? People like people who are like themselves. And your social net, like the university setting, is for many people, not of course all people, but especially in the developed world, many people, this is one of their formative parts of their life. And, that you went to an Ivy League university is a significant social fact, right? Or whether you didn't, or whatever, you know what I mean? Like that's that. So there's a lot of like trust and reputation that are built into this asset. So I think it's one of the more important ones we need to think about. There's other like government identities we need to start to think about, or various kinds of, there's just like the whole self-sovereign identity movement, I think is an important one. But I think this is one of the more important parts that we need to think about.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks a lot for taking the time. It's been a really great conversation. Maybe if you just want to leave with people some of your plugs, where can people keep up with you and your work?
Sure. I'm on Twitter, Quinn Dupont. Generally speaking, you can just Google Quinn Dupont and you'll find me. My book, Cryptocurrencies and
Are you the only one with that name?
Pretty much, yeah.
Nice.
I think so. My book, it's called Cryptocurrencies and Blockchain. It's out with Polity Press. It's I still think the only soup to nuts critical account. I mean, it's not critical in the sense of negative. It's critical in the sense of it's meaningfully engages with the subject matter in a way that doesn't just cheerlead it, as most books on crypto do. They're effectively just, if you want to hear someone confirm all of your own positive feelings about crypto, then there's many other books I would recommend. But if you want to actually understand what's going on, then I'd recommend my own. And as I said, I'm working on next one coming up for me is a little collection that'll be available open access online called Defining Web3. And we were successfully funded by a little bit of money from Gitcoin. And now we're going to be, it's a collected edition, 25 sort of the top researchers in the field talking about all variety of questions and issues around Web3. And my own contribution there will be my essay on progressive Web3. So that's something people can check out as well.
All right, cool. Thanks so much. I'm really looking forward to the series Progressive Web3. Hopefully, maybe by the time this gets published, we'll have part 2 already up, and I can put that into the show notes as well. But part 1, I'll definitely have there.
Wonderful. Cool. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.